The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, everyone. We're going to start the broadcast in about 3 minutes. I appreciate everyone jumping on early. Um, so stay tuned. We're about 2.5 minutes away. All right, everyone. We're at the top of the hour, so we're going to begin shortly. First, though, I did want to take a minute and thank everyone who registered for the webinar. We have once again broken a record. We obtained 792 attendees as of this morning, which I am very, very humbled that you would want to take time out of your day to listen to me. And as always, if you have other folks that you think would benefit from listening to the broadcast, please have them sign up. We do send the link to the YouTube within 24 hours of the broadcast, so no need to attend in person if you have a conflict. Uh, it's always good to listen to it afterwards. So let's get started. We've got a pretty full agenda, but I did want to say one of the difficulties we have with getting over 700 attendees is that we are unable to do live Q&A. So I'm going to still take questions, but you would send them to my email. I'll be providing that at the end of the broadcast. But I just wanted to make sure that everyone was still able to ask questions. And the advantage, I think, of my written response is that you'll get a little bit more than an off-the-cuff extemporaneous answer from me. So hopefully everyone will appreciate that. The other thing I do want to request is that if you do have suggestions for topics that you'd like to see us cover, please email those suggestions as well. So let's get started. And I think the biggest news of the last few weeks for the collision repair industry has been the CDK cyber incident. There were back-to-back incidents on June 18th and 19th that hit CDK dealer management systems. To give you an idea of the gravity of this, approximately 15,000 of the 18,000 new car dealers in the US were impacted because they are CDK customers. Crazy, because the DMS is truly the backbone of the dealership. And you know, I noticed from looking at the registration rolls that there are a number of parts departments and dealerships joining our call. Welcome. I thank you for joining. Um, but would love to hear your comments on how CDK is handling the uh, post-incident ramp up back to functionality. Now, interestingly enough, CDK reportedly paid the $25 million ransom in Bitcoin to the hackers, which means this was a serious thing that they could not work around. Um, they also did confirm that most dealers were brought back and had some, maybe most functionality returned by July 5th. But the really interesting thing is a lot of our customers are saying, hey, what was the impact to Parts Trader? Very minimal impact. Most dealers just reverted to the manual quoting and ordering process directly in Parts Trader. So when you look at the numbers over the time period post-incident versus pre-incident, the worst case scenario for some OEM manufacturers was a decline of zero point 0.3 quotes per OEM part. So not any significant impact on OEM business. Aftermarket, recycled, surplus, all stayed in normal business modes. But one of the biggest news stories, I think, is that the International Longshoremen's Association is rattling sabers for an East Coast strike. So the United States Maritime Alliance, known as USMX, is the business that runs the East Coast and the Gulf Coast ports in the U.S. Um, there was a union complaint that there was a port in the U.S. on the Gulf Coast that was processing the gate checks. So these are when the 80-foot containers leave the port. The union rules call for a union representative to be on site for those. One of these facilities did an automated gate check function, which is in violation of the agreement. Um, as a response, they canceled scheduled talks on the renewal of the contract. That contract expires September 30th of this year. So it could be a pretty big incident. To give you an idea, here are the 10 busiest ports in the United States. And we know from the incident that occurred in 2023 that Port of LA and Port of Long Beach, right next to each other in San Pedro and Long Beach harbors, were really shut down because of that. That impacted a lot of aftermarket parts being shipped in from Taiwan, as well as sub-supplier components for OE, both parts departments and vehicle constructions. They were coming from China, from Indonesia. So that was a very, very watched strike. A lot of people fretted over the potential impact of that. And it took a little bit of cleanup afterwards to get back into full production. To give you an idea of what an East Coast and Gulf Coast strike would be, of these top 10, 7 of these ports would potentially be impacted by a strike. So it's something to keep an eye out on. It will impact not only the aftermarket coming in from Taiwan, because they do come through the Panama Canal to have some deliveries to the East Coast, but it's also going to impact uh, European manufacturing. We get a lot from Eastern Europe that are being supplied to vehicle components for European made vehicles that are being manufactured either in Alabama, South Carolina, what have you. So this is a potentially the next thing to keep an eye out on and see how it'll impact the industry. Uh, the other thing we want to do, because what we like to do is look at the entire ecosystem of vehicle sales, vehicle repair, part supply trends to really see what it impacts this business. You know, we look at this as a three-legged stool. There are the part suppliers, the insurance company paying the bill, and the repairer repairing the vehicle. Looking at those three, the more cars we repair, the better the business is for everybody, right? So suppliers sell the parts. The insurance companies actually prefer to have a vehicle repaired, even when it's a heavier repair, because the chance of defection after a total loss, meaning the policyholder shops around and potentially goes to a new insurance company, is higher when there's a total loss versus a heavy repair. And then, of course, repairers stay in business by repairing cars. So one of the factors we look at is let's look at the seasonally adjusted annual rate of sale for new vehicles in the US because that shows you what will be in this car park of roughly 340 million vehicles we have on the road and play with the average age of vehicle on a road. So we look to have 16.4 million new vehicles sold in 2024. To give you a little bit of perspective, the record high, the all-time record high for new vehicle sales was 2016 at 17.5 million. Now, COVID, of course, had a pretty disastrous effect on sales, but interestingly, it was the microchip shortage in 2022 that drove new vehicle sales because of reduced production down to a mere 13.7 million new vehicles. The second thing we look at is how are prices of new vehicles on both, well, both new and used vehicles to see if they're going to come back to this equilibrium. I've heard every insurance company exec I've talked to complain about very, very high total loss rates. You know, pre-pandemic, we were looking at 25% of claims made resulting in a total loss. We see a lot of companies now saying it's north of 30%. So something has to give. You know, we have to get back into a more realistic uh, ecosystem for getting those total losses down and repairing more vehicles. The average new transaction price for a new car in the US was $47,433. That's down only 0.2% from the same time period last year. However, it's down significantly from December of 2022. Again, that was when the vehicle sales were low and dealers were demanding premium over MSRP. So it's returning, but it's not probably going to get to pre-pandemic levels. Now, used car prices across the board, this is sort of the top 10 of what happened in 2023. You can see a lot of vehicle nameplates decreased in value, led by, of course, Tesla. A lot of that was self-inflicted. That was Elon Musk lowering the price of popular models because he feared competition from Mercedes, BMW, and other manufacturers cutting into his luxury market EV dominance. That combined with Hertz selling off 20,000 of the 100,000 Teslas they bought also contributed to a lowering of resale value for Teslas. So you're seeing that sort of bubble through the rest of the industry, especially the EV industry. We're going to do a little bit more of a conversation about the EV industry and what it looks like going forward and what it means for the collision repair industry in just a few minutes. But first, I wanted to look at what also impacts, and that is the discontinuing of individual car brands or car makes. And we're going to start off with Kia. I had written an article a few months ago about the reduction of passenger vehicles and the rise of the crossover SUV contributing to a higher average repair cost. Because SUVs and crossover SUVs are exempt from the US bumper standards and bumper systems are different, there are about 2.2 parts more per vehicle repair for an SUV versus a sedan passenger car. So that's one of the things I always look at to look at parts trends, purchase trends going forward. So starting off with Kia, we have the Kia Rio, which is the answer to what's the cheapest car can I rent in the US. And on the other end is the Kia Stinger. That's the most expensive passenger car that Kia produced. They're pulling the plug on both of those vehicles. And when we get to Stellantis, this is really the big news. Starting off with their smallest crossover SUV, the Fiat 500X, the Jeep Renegade, which shares the platform with the 500X, the Jeep Cherokee, the Dodge Challenger, and the Chrysler 300 all discontinued. And lastly, the venerable Dodge Charger. All of these vehicles are leaving production. The Dodge Charger is the one that is most surprising to me because even with this apparent option of stenciling the new owner's credit score on the quarter panel, they've still decided to discontinue the vehicle. Now, for those keeping score at home, that means Chrysler, until they roll out their new uh, fleet of electric vehicle offerings, is down to a one vehicle brand. So the Chrysler Pacifica is the sole Chrysler product offered new in 2024. Now, Dodge doesn't fare much better with the Dodge Durango and the Dodge Hornet being the sole surviving Dodge vehicles before they make their transition to electric vehicles. The really interesting thing about this is that current unsold market day supply for the Dodge Durango is 184 days. But even worse for the poor Dodge Hornet, really nobody really likes these cars. 384 days of unsold market supply. And you say, well, what is unsold market supply? It really is, when you measure MDS, it's the current market quantity, meaning cars that have already been manufactured, either sitting at the manufacturing plants or on dealer lots. And then you divide that by the average daily sales rate for the last 45 days. So basically, for the Dodge Hornet, if they sold at the rate they're selling for today, it would take 384 days to sell off the remaining already produced inventory for the Dodge Hornet. So as Stellantis Group moves to become their goal of a full EV manufacturer by 2028, we'll see if that path changes any. But a lot of Chrysler dealers and Dodge dealers are truly depending on used vehicle parts and service to keep those dealerships healthy. Now we're going to take a little bit of a history lesson. The Ford Taurus. The Ford Taurus was introduced. It was remarkably aerodynamic for the time. It was the lowest coefficient of drag vehicle offered by a US manufacturer. And it went through 6 generations with a small hiatus and renamed from 2006 to 2007. They called it the Ford 500, but it was indeed actually the same thing as a Taurus. I have owned 4 Tauruses, or is the proper plural Tauri, because they're great cars to give your kids as their first car because they're invisible, they're cheap, and if they break, you just throw it away. It was America's best-selling car up until 1996 when they had the controversial oval restyle, which is that sort of emerald green one left middle. That was just not a good looking car. The restyled one on the right I've owned 3 of those. Those are actually pretty robust cars. So it was discontinued in 2019, but fear not, the Middle Eastern market always had a Taurus, and Ford has thought enough of this new vehicle to reintroduce it for the 2025 model year. So here's what we get based on artist rendering. This is the Taurus. That's actually what it's projected to look like. This is what the Middle Eastern car looks like. It will come with a 238 horsepower 4-cylinder turbo. There's also an SHO with a 3.5 liter twin turbo V6, putting out a pretty astonishing 365 horse and 350 foot-pound of torque. So it'll be a torquey little beast. The question is there a police interceptor model in the offerings? That's still unanswered, but I can guarantee that if you put a twin turbo with that kind of horsepower, a police interceptor seems like a natural for this model. Front wheel drive, as they all have been, with an optional all wheel drive. So, earlier I'd written the article about the demise of the passenger car, but even though Ford was one of the first ones to discontinue every single passenger car except for the Mustang, they are now returning to that. Because I think that this is an underserved market. I think there still is a market for passenger car vehicles. So we'll see going forward if General Motors, they're announcing a new fleet of potential hybrids and ICE vehicles. We'll see what happens. Some of the other things that impact total loss settlements and repair versus replace vehicle decisions are financing. This is pretty scary. We have not seen a rate cut. So interest rates on new vehicles, 7.1% during the first quarter of 2024, according to Edmunds.com. The average new car loan term is now 68.3 months. The other key performance indicator to watch on those is the negative equity. And unfortunately, negative equity hit another record high, with the average negative equity being rolled into a new car loan of $6,167. That's up a full 18% from a year earlier. This is really scary because that means that these folks that are financing like that will have over 5.5 years, but have a $6,100 bogey that they have to overcome to see, daylight at the end of that loan. When you total out a vehicle and the customer has that kind of negative equity, all they end up doing is rolling a higher amount into the new replacement vehicle loan. That's a touchy thing. At some point, that's not sustainable. Um, so to give you an idea of what that means in average payment, the average payment year over year from 2023 to 2024 remains flat at $700, with 17% of all customers having a single car payment of more than $1,000. Earlier this year, I did a presentation where we showed which states had the highest frequency of over $1,000 on a single car loan, and one would think, oh, it was got to be California or Texas. It was actually the great state of Montana had the most vehicles with a single car payment of over $1,000. Switching gears and looking at an electric vehicle update, a recent McKinsey study was pretty surprising to me. And full disclosure, I have a full EV. You're going to see a picture of it in a little bit. Uh, but 40% of current EV owners say that they would go back to an internal combustion engine or a hybrid, according to the McKinsey study. 29% of the EV owners across the globe said that they are likely to buy an ICE vehicle the next time. So again, 40% in the US, but across the globe, it's 29%. And their major complaint was the inadequacy of public charging infrastructure. And I got to tell you, that is one of my major complaints as well, and stops me from using that EV for long-term road trips. And the range anxiety, that idea of I will not be able to make a long road trip in my EV. And if I run out, I can't just get a can of electricity to refuel it to get to the next charging station. Interestingly enough, Automotive News put out a recent study on running cost comparison by state. So this takes into consideration what the kilowatt hour charges for your various power companies in the state versus the gasoline prices. And you can see that the range cost savings for EV versus gas is in every state, but it varies pretty significantly depending on kilowatt hours. You can see expensive states have a smaller gap between running costs of a gas-powered vehicle versus an EV. The interesting thing, this does not take into consideration total cost of ownership. Uh, One of the things that I've noticed in my EV ownership is they're next to no maintenance, which is great, other than tires, which seem to be they go through pretty fast. But the depreciation of the vehicle is far in excess of a full gas-powered vehicle. The best vehicles on the depreciation cycle are hybrids. Uh, so we'll see if that trend continues in the future. But running cost comparison, there are a lot of factors to take into consideration. Total cost of ownership. It is probably always better to lease an EV at this point than to actually purchase it, as you build some of the depreciation arc into the lease cost. So looking at the future of these EV sales, there's a lot of headlines about, oh my gosh, everyone's pulling back from this full-on move to EV. JD Power now forecasts that the EV market share will hit 12.4% of registered vehicles in the US in 2024. That's not going away, and that will impact how we do collision repair. So this is a 63% gain, but it's actually down just under a point from JD Power's original prediction. So there is some softening of that market. The really interesting thing is this broad expansion in 2023, EV sales grew at a 50% pace. So we are over 1 million vehicles as of 2023, and we'll hit over 1.2 million EVs sold in 2024. A lot of that growth, however, is an exercise in price elasticity. A lot of the growth was driven by Tesla, which is responsible for over half of the increase in sales. And the reason that is, in my mind, is that Tesla, on their very popular models, again, fearing the competition from Mercedes, BMW, and some of the other luxury manufacturers, aggressively cut prices. BMW and Mercedes, to give you an idea of what their EV market share is only 7 and 8% respectively. It's really, really a small portion of their business. I was at a Mercedes dealer and eavesdropped on a sales presentation, uh, a sales meeting to the salespeople, and they were all complaining that they could not move any of the EVs. So we'll see what happens. But further explore the idea of elasticity, I'm going to bring up the example of the Mach-E, the Mustang Mach-E. Ford cut prices of Mach-E's that were unsold 2023 models. They cut prices by $8,100 in February of 2024. Their Mach-E EV sales nearly tripled because of that. The problem is that Ford was already losing money on each of the Mach-E's that they had sold before that 8,100 aggressive price cut. So you will see buyers buy EV at the right price, but you're not going to see manufacturers making a heck of a lot of money off of them. And the old adage is, I'd give you the car, but I'd sell you all the replacement parts. That really doesn't work as well with an EV. Now, further EV news, EV manufacturer Polestar, which, gosh, that sounds like a documentary on HBO about exotic dancers, but it's actually Volvo's electric vehicle division. It used to be the name of their racing division. They have proposed, Volvo has, a dissolution of 62, almost 63 points of their share held in Polestar. They said, oh, we're going to end up with about an 18% stake in Polestar, which Volvo says is enough to exert some influence over Polestar. Maybe I'm naive, but 63% holding is probably a lot more power over influence over Polestar than a mere 18%. Polestar is interesting, though. They intend on expanding their commercial footprint around the globe, entering 7 new markets with Polestar models in 2025. So again, mixed news. You really have to look at the complete picture for EVs to figure out what this will look like in a few years. And when we get back to what does this mean for us in this world, and I promised you a picture of my EV. Yes, this is my EV that was rear-ended in a parking lot by a teenager in a Suburban, doing $6,300 in damage to that little beast. EV repairs require just under 91% OEM parts as compared to 66.5% OEM parts for internal combustion vehicles. No great mystery here. Most EVs are specific models and do not share a lot of sheet metal with full non-EVs, so they are unique parts. They also have a lower percentage of repairable parts, also not a big surprise because it's usually a lightweight aluminum or a specialized plastic that cannot be repaired. And then lastly, interestingly, is that 21% or EVs are 21% more likely to be drivable after a collision versus ICE vehicles. And again, you go down to the fact that if you're rear-ending somebody in an ICE vehicle, you've exposed the air conditioning, the radiator, a lot of potential leakages, and in an EV, it's just going to be the front trunk. So the interest to me was the difference in repair cost, $963 more on average to repair an EV than a traditional ICE vehicle. And again, that goes down to uh, the lower repairability of parts, the specialized parts, the higher OE content, all leading to a higher repair cost. Now, lastly, we're going to look at parts performance. We're going to point out a couple of things happening uh, across the globe and look at the impact of the UAW strike on parts pricing. So what I've done here is looked at the average part price by part type. And the important thing here is to say, let's look at these and look at where there is competition. So what I'm looking at is there an aftermarket part made and what's the OEM equivalent? So I'm not measuring an aftermarket fender and comparing it to a population where it's clips and fasteners. This is true one-to-one competition. So a couple of things as we look across the board, we see uh, the inflationary, if I put a trend from 2020 to 2024 through the 1st of July, put a trend line across OEM parts, I can see an inflation rate. And if I do the same thing on the red line, which is recycled parts, I can see that recycled parts are actually growing at a higher inflationary rate than OEM parts. That is really interesting to me because that is a part whose pricing is truly linked to the OEM MSRP. So you would expect those things to be fairly equal, but what we're seeing is an inflationary rate. And we're going to dig down a little bit of detail. And part of that is that it was influenced by the UAW strike and the potential worry of shortage of parts components, causing collision repairs to increase their utilization of salvage parts and salvage assemblies during that strike time. The other thing I wanted to point out is look at the aftermarket. That's purple. That is the lowest. You can actually see that year over year, for the last 2 years, we see at the end of the measurement period a lower price. We're now at in July the average aftermarket part price at $309 versus December of 2023 at $316. The other piece here to point out is this really interesting and very radical curve of recycled parts. Again, or sorry, remanufactured parts. That really comes down to just remanufacturing of alloys. There are a lot of factors in that. Is the core usable? Is that what's, do you have to pay for a core? Is the wheel size actually bigger? Because, the bigger the wheel, the more labor involved. And there still is somewhat of a shortage of remanufacturing technicians that are in those remanufacturing facilities. So those all have led to an inflation rate for the remanufactured alloy wheels. Looking again, and I said, we're going to take a look at the average part price by part type. I want to look at it at a short period of time. This is the impact of the UAW strike, and point out a couple of things. I had mentioned earlier that repairs shops were looking more at the recycled part and buying those than they had before, because during the strike there was the fear, hey, I can get the door, but I can't get the belt molding, or I can get the door shell new OE, but I may have a back order on the mirror. So there was this push to buy more recycled assemblies so that I could get, if I'm a repairer, each and every component of that car and turn that car faster. The inflationary rate, the average part cost during the strike for OEM parts stayed completely flat. We saw a little bit of a rise in September of October in that purple, that aftermarket piece. You saw OEM surplus, that's a supply and demand thing, that went down and then rocketed up afterwards. But really wanted to point out that, the three OEs that were impacted by the UAW strike, Ford, General Motors, and Stellantis, all really reached out to their dealers. They knew they had a lot of advance notice that there could potentially be a strike. So there was a lot of advising of the parts dealers, and I'd love to hear from any of the parts dealers, collision truckload dealers, etc., to say, what were the encouragements that you got prior to the strike to load up on inventory to help weather the UAW strike. The other thing we saw is that some of the manufacturers pulled back on the population of parts that were available for conquest, preserving the margin versus expanding the sale. We have seen that in the aftermath and the settlement of the UAW strike, that there really hasn't been a complete restoration of those parts that had previously been on conquesting programs. Those part numbers are not currently available in the conquesting world. So I'd love to hear from various parts departments to see how their sales are going versus aftermarket for those parts that may or may not have been taken off the conquesting. The other thing I want to do is let's take a little bit of a deeper dive to look at selected and ordered parts by top part makes over time. So the four bars at the top, we look at OEM part share. Now again, we look at percentage of parts by part count and not by parts dollars. There's a fundamental flaw in looking at percentage of parts dollars. So when we look at, this is truly at part count. So this is saying basically, when we look at all of parts, 71.1% are still selected and ordered OE, 11.3 are selected and ordered Kappa. Insurance quality, which are the aftermarket marketing programs that you're probably familiar with, and then other would be primarily either an OE overstock or the biggest category would be recycled parts. But we look at a couple of things. Looking on the left, you can see that we've taken four major part types and four major brands, two domestic, two Asian, and look at the OEM utilization for each of them. The one thing I really want to point out is the impact of patent parts. When you look at front lamps in particular, this is a great place to look at, are these manufacturers putting the logo in the headlamp assembly so that it potentially would not be a like kind and quality substitution for a Kappa part. So looking at front lamps, you can see that across all models of Chevrolet, OEM holds 59% to the Kappa certified of 10%. Let's look at Honda, 49% OE to 24%, and then Toyota, 31% front lamps Kappa certified. So that really illustrates the impact of these logos and patents appearing on these popular parts. Sheet metal is not as radical of a difference. GM and Ford are really the pioneers in patenting parts and part design, but you can see this difference overall. And then over on the right, the part utilization trend, you can see this sort of decrease over time of OEM utilization. And we're going to look at a specific vehicle series to kind of illustrate that point in more detail. And here it is. This is the 2018 to 2023 Toyota Camry body style. So it is, the series that ran. It's a popular series. It is AARP's most insured vehicle. And looking at these numbers specifically for that series of Camry, looking up at the bar across the chart, Whereas when we looked at those four major brands, again, uh, Toyota as a brand was part of this, but looking at the vehicle yields some pretty significantly different numbers. So OEM utilization for the 18 to 23 Camry is 58.9% versus across the board from the earlier chart where it was 71.1. Kappa is a full 23.9 versus across the board previously at 11.9. We look at this pretty dramatic drop off for this vehicle series in OEM utilization as time goes on. And you think, gosh, that's really not great. But the one thing we have to do is remember that the way that most insurance companies operate is that 1 year, 12,000 miles, slightly different for some manufacturer or for some insurance companies, but it usually is around that 12 months, 12 months, 12,000 miles that they allow OEM only, and then after that they'll step into a quality aftermarket part allowance. So as you look at that, it's truly just the population every year, every calendar year, another 300,000 Toyota Camrys hit this availability of aftermarket parts. And so that's really what's the key to this idea of a rapid decline in OEM utilization. So we chose that Toyota Camry because it is a very, very good example. Uh, Other examples of domestic and other European vehicles, Asian vehicles, pretty similar trend over time, but that's just really the underlying key as to why OEM utilization goes down as that particular vehicle series gets older. Next, we're going to look at delivery times because one of the things that we found, especially during the strike, and you'll see it up there, the upper left where we have the bar chart, this is a look at the median delivery days plus 2 standard deviations. And that sounds like a math geek on steroids, but really what that is to say, if I've got 10 parts on the estimate and everyone is delivered in a day and a half, but the one part, that 10th part, takes 5 days to deliver. If I just averaged 1.5 on the 9 parts and the 5 days on that one part, if I average that, I'm not going to get a true impact of that one outlying part. The reason we look at that we want to quantify the outlying, slow delivery part is that's what causes rental delays. If you look at Collision Week, every quarter Enterprise Rent-A-Car publishes their length of rental for repairable vehicles. They ask us to comment on it, and it is amazing on a state level and then nationally how closely our data trends line up. So when they see a decrease or an increase in rental car, we see a corresponding correlation to length of delivery days. So again, a long-winded way of saying when I look at 14.8 days in October of 2023, that was that one outlying part that probably caused that vehicle not to be delivered on time. But you can see that, that was the strike. Little bit of an up ramp because the strike started in the middle of September, went through October, recovery period afterwards. But the good news is that we are actually for since March really trending significantly below all part types. Again, we're looking at all part types here, significantly below the median plus 2 standard deviations, even before the strike last year. Upper right chart here just basically shows by brand. The darker the blue, the lower the median delivery days are. When it gets to red, like you'll see Acura, BMW, Cadillac, Buick, and Ram, those are above the median. And then when you look at a state level chart, you can see sort of the state distributions. When we pull out a particular part type, we can see that truly OEM parts drove the median delivery times because there are so many OEM parts. So you're going to see that overall we were at 11.8 days. When you look at just OEM parts, you're at 17. The good news is the trend continues that for the last 4 months or so, you're at 11 days basically, and that is better than it was prior to the strike of 2023. Looking at aftermarket, it's a completely different uh, animal here because again, it's a finite number of parts, it's high competition parts, it's regional warehouses, and so you're seeing a lot of these large companies doing milk runs. So when you have a limited number of parts with good stock, you don't have those kind of outliers like you would with the OE that is required to supply all of those little bits and bobs. So it is a little bit different, but just looking at the outliers, we see, again, if I lay a trend line, we see a little bit of a rise in delivery days of aftermarket parts, but at 3.2 days, that should not really impact the overall repair of the car. Excuse me. Lastly, when we look at recycled, again, a little bit of an uptick in the most recent months, but surprisingly, during the strike, it was pretty, even though they had increased demand, the delivery days were pretty steady. The interesting thing is the December was the highest month. Again, when you look at a scale that's much smaller with a 0 to 4 axis, it's going to sort of magnify the impact of some of those days. But it still is interesting to point out that there are far less, uh, orange in the vehicle make. So there's good representation. Ram is the outlier at 4.6 for delivery days, but overall we see a lot of blue on a per manufacturer median delivery days. So really that has brought us to the end of the update. Again, if you have questions, I apologize that we cannot answer them live. I do love doing that. It spurs a lot of back and forth conversation, but I hope you take advantage of emailing me at greg.horn@partstrader.com with both your industry questions, your specific questions. I'll try and answer them in much more detail than I could in a few second response. But also, if you have suggestions for any future content, any future subject you would like to have covered, I am happy to entertain those. Um, Not a guarantee that we'll definitely cover them, but I do like to get suggestions because it keeps it relevant. I hope you found this presentation relevant, insightful, to give you some things to look out for in the industry in the near future in the news or what's going to impact this industry. And with that, again, I want to humbly thank everyone for attending. Just pleased as can be that we reached 792 uh, attendees. So my heartfelt thanks, and I will see you very soon. Go out and make it a great day. Thank you.